Hey, Lucy. How you doing?
I'm good, how are you?
Doing great.
Okay, it's time to begin this morning. Good to see you. Man, we've been longing to be with everybody. Being gone so long in Dallas and then having services canceled because of things. And so it's good to be back with you. We're going to look at Luke chapter 19, and this will be our last session in Luke, because next quarter Charlie Body's going to begin a series of lessons in here on Sunday morning. So I wanted to look at chapter 19 and beginning with the parable of the 10 minas. Because I think this sort of would provide a good summary of Luke itself and what Luke's presentation about Jesus is all about. So, we're skipping the one on Zacchaeus, which is a great story as well. I would say if you would go over, just because I may not have time to look at this with you, but turn over to Luke chapter 24. When you're familiar with the road to Emmaus, when the two disciples are talking and then Jesus is there with them, and he opens their minds to understand the scripture, and it's kind of like, oh, now we get it, wow. There is, for Luke, an emphasis of that's carried over, bless you, that's carried over into the book of Acts, which is also Luke's second volume. You have Luke Acts. And I've always found this to be very, very interesting. Let's start in, I guess, verse 31 of Luke 24. He says, and this is, so let's go back to verse 28, get the context. He says, so they drew near to the village to which they were going. He acted as if he were going farther, but they urged him strongly, saying, stay with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is now far spent. So he went in to stay with them. When he was at table with them, he took the bread and blessed it and broke it and gave to them, and their eyes were opened. Notice the connection at the point in which their eyes are open and him doing what? Breaking the bread. Now, if we missed it, Luke's going to emphasize that again. He says, he took the bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, did not our hearts burn within us while he talked with us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures? And they rose the same hour and returned to Jerusalem. And they found the 11 and those who were with them gathered together, saying, the Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon. And they told what had happened on the road and how he was known to them in the what? The breaking of the bread. Now, do you suppose that Luke is emphasizing what would become the Lord's Supper? I think so, because even in Acts chapter 1, we have a list of New Testament acts of worship, and that being the breaking of bread. And so, why would Luke end, if you please, with that reference or that theme? What's the purpose of it? He's the only one that does this.
But Jesus
said he would not, when he, with the disciples, when he did the bread and the wine, that he would not eat with them again until
the kingdom comes. Yeah, that's very interesting. So to me, it gives a real emphasis and importance to our observance of what? The Lord's Supper, communion. It is our, in fact, the book of Corinthians, 1 Corinthians would refer to it as a participation in the death, in the sacrifice of Jesus. We're participating. It's a fellowship. And so I have never heard in my time in the church and hearing preachers do anything, anybody ever use this as the text and talking about the Lord's Supper. Now, 1 Corinthians, 11 we use all the time, right? But we recognize him in the breaking of the bread, emphasizing the sacrifice, the blood that's shed. It's the central aspect of one who had no sin, took our sin. God laid our sin upon him. And through that sacrifice, there's now no condemnation to those who are in Christ, right? So it's a pivotal period. It makes me also understand why the weekly observance of the Lord's Supper, and that it is central to our fellowship, our communion together, and it's a reminder for us each and every week, first day of the week, of the blessing of what we have. So I just wanted to bring that out because I don't think I'll be able to get there. So I want to go back to Luke chapter 19, beginning in verse 11 with the parable of the minas. Now, you'll see a similarity with this parable with another that Jesus has told, that another gospel has recorded. But this is kind of interesting because it lays out a lot of the issues that are involved that Jesus has been addressing and has been facing during his ministry. Okay? So let's begin. He says, as they heard these things, he proceeded to tell a parable. Because he was near, notice this, he was near to Jerusalem. We've talked about the emphasis of the theme in Luke about his travel to Jerusalem. It takes the whole Gospel of Luke before he gets there. It's kind of like the theme is set in Luke chapter 9. He put his face. There was an intentionality. There's a strategy. The goal, the purpose is to get to Jerusalem. And of course, it's to get to Jerusalem to do what? To die, to sacrifice himself. Okay? And so now he's near. And so Luke has a way of emphasizing this walk. And of course, discipleship mirrors that. We are to what? Die to self, live for Christ. So it's an interesting way of illustrating what our life as Christians is to be. And being, to Jerusalem, and because they supposed that the kingdom of God was to appear immediately. That gives you some insight, which we have discussed throughout Luke, of the perspective of the disciples concerning the kingdom. It is true that Jesus has been telling his disciples that the kingdom of God is near. It's at hand, and it is. It's very near. But they have a different, concept of what it's going to be. So they think it's going to be immediately, and in light of Luke, it's not going to be many days from the point at which Jesus is crucified, of course, when the kingdom finally arrives. He said, therefore, a nobleman went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom and then return. Calling 10 of his servants, he gave them 10 minas and said to them, engage in business until I come. But his citizens hated him and sent a delegation after him, saying, we do not want this man to reign over us. When he returned, having received the kingdom, he ordered these servants to whom he had given the money to be called to him, that he might know what they had gained by doing business. The first came before him, saying, Lord, your mina has been made 10 minas more. And he said to them, well done, good servant. Kind of reminds you of the parable of talents, right? He says, because you have been faithful in very little, you shall have authority over 10 cities. There's lots of differences between this and the parable of the talents. He says, because you have done faithful in very little, you'll be over 10 cities. And the second one came and said, Lord, your mina has made 5 minas. And he said to him, are you, and you are to be over 5 cities. Then another one came saying, Lord, here is your mina, which I kept laid away in a handkerchief. For I was afraid of you, because you are a severe man. You take what you do not deposit and reap what you do not sow. He said to him, I will condemn you with your own words, you wicked servant. You knew that I was a severe man, taking what I did not deposit and reaping what I did not sow. Why then did you not put my money in the bank? And at my coming I might have collected it with interest. And he said to those who stood by, take the mina from him and give it to the one who has 10 minas. And they said to him, Lord, he has 10 minas. I tell you that everyone who has more will be given more, but from the one who has not even what he has will be taken away. But as for these enemies of mine, who did not want me to reign over them, bring them here and slaughter them before me. Oh my. All right, let me get your response to this. Talk to me about the parable. What do you see? What surprises you? What stands out? What kind of maybe is troubling or bothersome? What do you see? Who's he talking about? What's this all about?
He's talking about your decision to choose to serve the kingdom of God, and the choices are life and death. I mean, you either choose Christ's path and have the opportunity for everlasting life, or you choose to be, follow Satan, which means certain death. Okay.
So the responsibility of choice and, putting that to action, that we've got to be accountable and responsible for what the master's given, that's similar to the parable of the talents, okay? What else? Think of the differences between what you already know about the parable of talents and what this particular parable that's similar, but is addressing some different things as well. A mina is, I think, the average of 3 months of wages. It's different from a denarius, which is 1 day labor wages, and a talent, which is a lot, of money. Anyway, what else do you see?
Well, it's different in that he's taking it away and giving it to the guy with 10, because he's rewarding the people that have been a good steward versus the people that haven't. I don't know that the other one kind of, the other place that it's at did not imply that he gave the money to the person that had the more, or I can't remember if he did or not.
I think in the parable of talents that happens.
Does it seem like this story, the master is a ruthless man, like despised by the men, instead of during the talents? Does it mention that he? Yeah,
it mentions that they knew he was what is that? Matthew I can't remember what chapter. Y'all remember?
Just seems like he comes across this time as like.
Yeah, you know, it almost seems more severe than the one we remember with the parable of talents, which the guy who had the one who hid it also had that to say about him, but it's not as a severe of a statement that is made by this, you know, in this particular parable. Who is Jesus talking to? Who are the players in the parable? You know, a parable is something that's, you know, using figures and things to address, you know, what's real. You know, it's kind of like a way, it's almost inductively, the people who probably heard this, the disciples, others, would recognize, just like I remember one occasion, the lawyers, the Pharisees got mad with Jesus because they, you know, they inferred that he was talking about them from the parable that he was talking about. Yeah.
Talking about the Jews at that time, but now he's talking to people at Elmore Church of Christ.
That's right. So let's look at it in its original context and then make the application. So who are the players? Who are the people? Who are the servants that receive? And what is the message? Is he indicating a warning? Who are the ones that are like observing? And the ones who say, we don't want him to rule over us, and then they're slaughtered. You know, go ahead.
And the Sadducees.
Yeah, the religious leaders of the day, which Luke has, you know, been characterizing as those who have continually rejected what? The true kingdom. They're not, they're in it for themselves. They love money, riches, you know, the status, all the things that come with being who they are in the position that they occupy. Notice the son, or this individual, is sent to receive a kingdom. Okay? Which is interesting too, which is showing you that the kingdom is near, and he comes back having received the kingdom. Okay? And going back to what was said about the choice, those who said, you will not reign over me, experience a Samuel slaughter. You remember Samuel and King Agag? You remember that story in 1 Samuel? I think it's chapter 15, where Israel's told to go and do what? Kill the wicked people known as the Amalekites. And that's because the Amalekites ambushed Israel when they came out of Egyptian bondage, and the time of their punishment was now at hand. And so when Saul became king, God sent him to go punish the Amalekites, leave nothing alive. And Saul went and destroyed the Amalekites, but he kept the best of the flock. He kept the king, you know, no doubt to parade. That's what ancient Near Eastern kingdoms did. They did parade the defeated people, especially the king, before the people, humiliate him in front of everybody, as everybody roared and cheered, threw things at him, and then they would kill him in front of everybody. But the king, Agag, who was, you know, brought by Saul to, I guess, you know, display that he was the victor over the Amalekites. And Samuel saw that, and Samuel hewed, slaughtered, just the term, I mean, hewed him, whacked him down with a sword. After Saul said, I'd obey the Lord, but, you know, obviously he partially obeyed, which is tantamount to disobeying. You can't partially obey, you gotta obey. Partial obedience is disobedience. You know, that must be a concept that I think people forget. That it's, you know, Saul was trying to do other things and had other intentions. So when you see this parable, that's the first thing I thought about was the whacking of Agag. You know? And I'm wondering, in writing this, Luke is intentionally, in the way that he writes it, bringing up that image. You know, as Jesus is referring, not directly, but in an allusion, reference the theme of what happens to those who say, you're not going to reign over me. So I think those individuals are representing the leaders of Israel who were supposed to be the exemplars of those who followed God and did his will. And yet, it seems on every hand, as the prophet said in the Old Testament, and other ways, things they did, they might speak that they're following God, but by their actions, they illustrate something else. So that's a real severe and difficult, hard parable, isn't it? I mean, this is a parable I think that's really has some bite in it, of causing people to need to think about this. So he went and received the kingdom, came back, and while he was gone receiving the kingdom, the ones that he left his money. What do you think the minas represent? Just out of curiosity. I know what it is in actuality, but from the parable, it's symbolic of what? What does the mina represent?
The ability, the God-given abilities that God has imparted on each of us to use for his purpose.
Okay. God-given abilities could be one. What's another? Another way of looking at that? You know, when we talk about the parable of talents, when you think about talent, you think about abilities. Not the sum of money of a talent, right? I think in this particular reference, yeah, maybe there is God-given abilities, but what is the real message in regard to these individuals who received this sum of money?
Something's deliverable to them. I mean, something is deliverable
Something
to God.
Was given, and they are, as a result, when the individual is away, that individual has
opportunities that God gives us.
Opportunities.
Yeah, maybe something
An expectation that there's a yield.
An expectation was there. What were you?
Faithfulness.
Their faithfulness. I remember the New Testament says it is required of blank to be faithful. Y'all remember? Can y'all fill in the blank? It's Paul to Timothy. It's required of, what's the word I'm looking at? The position. Who is one that handles the affairs of another? It's my fault. Let me put it another way.
Wife?
That's why I got married.
A manager.
A steward. Who said that? Chris. I don't have anything to give you. Good job. Yeah, a steward. A steward is what? Describe the work of a steward. He responsible for what's been given to him to manage, to oversee, right? And then he is accountable for what he has managed and what he has received. You know, that's a steward, right? So Paul, and I think this is the parallel, Paul is telling Timothy that stewards are required to be faithful, and it comes in the context of the doctrine and the teachings of Jesus. Do you suppose it is opportunity, it is talent, right? But it's deeper than that. What was given to the apostles? What was the stewardship of the apostles?
Preach the gospel.
Huh? Yeah, the teachings, the doctrines of Christ. What was the stewardship of Israel? They had what was called in the book of Romans, you remember? The oracles of God. So who wasn't or who hasn't shown themselves to be the faithful steward? Well, the leaders, you know, there were some leaders that are good. I'm not saying all leaders. Not all Pharisees were bad. You know, you have the example of Nicodemus. And not all priests were bad because, you know, there were a lot who were trying to do the right things. But as a general idea, Israel were not good stewards of the oracles of God, teachings, the message of God. Now, it's yet to be determined, think about this, that the 12 are going to be what? Good stewards of the oracles of God. So, just throwing it out there, do you think that in reference to the immediate application that he's talking like a parent would to a child, but yet the message is to all the children, you know? The implication of the failure of those who had not handled the oracles of God, but believed they had the kingdom, the religious leaders. And is there a warning, a message to his disciples, not just the 12, but also, you know, the others who have come, that there is a stewardship, a responsibility. Now notice the stewardship is more emphasized in the parable of the talents, in which each one was given according to their what? Their abilities. Okay? That's not the emphasis in this text per se, but it seems to be implied because of the different amounts given. You know, why do you give 2, then why do you give 5, or what have you? The point is that whatever it is, we are to be faithful stewards of. Because there is the management, proper faithful, as someone said up here, proper faithfulness to what God has given to us and the accountability that comes. Which shows you the 2 ways that was emphasized. It's either receiving more, which I think is, you know, it's the idea of being blessed because of your faithfulness of your stewardship.
What does that mean, receive more?
Good question.
Receive more what?
What do you think? Have any ideas?
I don't know. Are there levels of heaven?
Yeah.
Blessings of what?
Yeah.
Spiritual or physical?
That's a good question. Any ideas?
I think it's more for whatever God's purpose is for the person. I mean, if whatever your lot in life is, if there's a way that he can use your life by advancing your career, advancing your wealth, whatever, for his purpose, I think it means more in that way, because, I mean, we're all dependent on God, and it's toward his purpose.
Yeah, I think in regard to Nick's observation, are you taking this as when he comes back with a kingdom, that's the second coming?
I'm referring to when they received more because of their investment. He was blessing them more.
Yeah.
Like literally blessing them more. Well, literally in this case, is it physical with wealth, material wealth? Or is it
the parable doesn't say.
Spiritual blessing when they get to heaven.
The parable doesn't indicate that. I think the reference is more not to what is it, but it's the general understanding that one is blessed when they're faithful with what they have. Some would say maybe it's the more appreciation of things, you know, in regard to, I don't personally think there's degrees in heaven.
Maybe it's
But-
like the lady that owed, or the person that owed more money
Yeah,
and was forgiven.
we'll love more.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
appreciated it more.
It's, yeah, appreciate it more. That would be a good one to use as an illustration.
Scott, do you think that also, though, it's a warning toward obediency, where, you know, they're looking for these things on an immediate basis, and he's telling them that, you know, this is the long game. I mean, you.
Yeah,
and
I
he
think you're
knows
correct there.
from him, you know, living as a man and being with, you know, us on earth, that our nature is that, you know, we have an attention span of a gnat, and we like, you know, we think that we need these things, the immediacy of it, and if we don't, we kind of lose sight of things the longer it goes.
Mhm.
And I think part of that is he's warning against that this is something that you're gonna have to be disciplined about over time.
Right. Now, one of the things I think I would caution about is that he's using a parable to illustrate some important truths. And it's not always that every little thing about a parable is representing something. You see what I'm saying? That unless it's stated or Jesus interprets it as an allegory where everything has its meaning, that's one thing. But when it's not told to us this is an allegory, it's a parable, a story that Jesus told, it has significant spiritual, big observations about it.
Well, maybe like with the increase of blessing, maybe that's his way of saying this is how God appreciates your service.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah.
Well, I like, it's interesting to me that he goes, okay, the one who is giving the minas, he goes to receive his kingdom. You've got to think, it seems to me, that the stress on the kingdom, okay, has in reference ultimately to what? The church. That's how I would take it, because of going into the book of Acts, and Acts chapter 2, you have the birthday of the kingdom, the arrival of the kingdom. Okay? You have the new covenant that's opened up for the first time and basically read to the people. You have the changing of law from Mosaical, patriarchal, to the law of who? The law of Christ. The Pentecost is the place in Acts chapter 2 when everything shifts, where now we're under the law of Christ, not under the law of Moses. We're not under the law of conscience, as I would say the Gentiles were. We're under the law of Christ. That's why Paul in Romans would refer that both Jew and Gentile are condemned unless by faith they come to Christ and obey him. So, I think it has reference primarily to the coming of a church, which in reality would be confusing to whom? I think to the Jews, also to the disciples. They even question in Acts chapter 1, don't they? Are you going to do what? Remember, before he ascended? Go to Acts chapter 1.
I mean, I think they all had this throughout.
Yeah.
This expectation of a conquering king.
Just like remember Israel wanted a king to do what? What was it that they wanted from God and Samuel was heartbroken over? They wanted a king to be like
Everybody else.
everybody else, all nations. Now that's significant. This is played out throughout the Old Testament and even in the minds of the disciples. They could not grapple with being a king, our kingdom, with God as their ruler, with no earthly king. Think about that for a minute. There's no comparison. Where do you go to in the ancient Near Eastern civilizations to see a pure, what we would call a theocracy? You know, there's always a king, even though they had gods and stuff like that. You know, to be like other nations, when they looked at Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Persians, all of these people had what? A king that fought their battles, a king that led them. And Samuel, God finally allows them to have it, but he warns them. What will the king do? The earthly king, which you've rejected me, I'll give you an earthly king, and this is going to be the consequence. What was the consequences?
Your sons will be killed.
Your sons will be killed.
Land will be gone.
The land will be taken. High taxation. It's just inevitable, see? But how do you live and function with a pure theocracy? God is our king. Who's the leader? God is. Who's in charge? God is. It's just difficult to grasp that concept, which comes to fruition in the church.
But Mosaic law had this, hierarchy of all these, your heredity and your lineage that was passing through, and that fell into the same thing as all these other kingdoms and these kings, and it was a bloodline that, so they had that's the other thing that they had in their mind with the Mosaic law. And then on top of that, it's this monumental change to a servant leadership. And so all these things combined are like, they're struggling. The Jewish people trying to wrap their head around all these things that they've fought for thousands of years. You start looking at it from, the prophets saying that the Messiah is going to descend from all these things that they set up that play into what they have in their mind.
The brilliance of God's providence and what he did through the law, and pointing ultimately to what salvation would be and what the true kingdom would be like. And think about this for a minute. Terry, who's the head of the church?
Christ.
Who's the head of the church here?
Christ.
Christ. You're not.
No. Good thing too.
You're an elder though, right? But you're a what as an elder? And what am I as an elder and a preacher?
We're servants.
Stewards. Servants. We're stewards. You see? So on that level, how could one be a Diotrephes? Do you know who Diotrephes is, right? 3 John, isn't it? John says, I have something to say to Diotrephes because he likes to be what?
The boss.
The boss, the first, the head. And he actually opposes the apostles, and he'll put people out of the church. The emphasis is he's assuming a status or position or authority that he does not have. Now, if every person understands that the head of the church is Christ, how does then Christ who's in heaven govern his church?
Spiritual leadership.
Through the Word.
Spiritual leadership.
Spiritual leadership through the New Testament.
See, that
Through
was
his
what
word.
the problem was in Samuel's day. And I don't want to say this in a bad way, but Samuel didn't raise his children right.
Yeah.
They were horrible.
Yeah,
And so they didn't want his children to take his place. He was old, he was fixing to die. But at the same time, just like he says to judges, every man did as he thought fit in his own heart. There was no king in Israel. Everybody did what was in their own And
heart.
that's the same way with the church.
Yeah,
Now, if we don't have good leadership, which a lot of congregations are failing to have, then the local congregation suffers.
yeah. But the thing is that the head of the church is Jesus. He's the head. We are his functioning what? Body, whether you're an elder or a teacher or a deacon or whatever. My authority,
The overseers, right? The elders of the overseers.
they're overseers.
But
They have been
are to
imbued
lead
with,
into Christ's
Right.
teachings, not their own.
right. I can't exercise authority that I don't have, which is the example of Diotrephes. So it kind of keeps you a little humble. One thing, there's no room, as many in the Corinthian church began to do, elevating themselves over others, particularly over miraculous gifts that you'll read in your readings. It's a challenge. And this is why human beings struggle even within the church. Because they forget. They say it, Jesus is the head, but they forget that they are stewards and accountable. We will give elders, will elders give an account to Jesus for their oversight of the congregation? Okay, so Jesus returns, he's given us stewardship, and then there will be an account of, there's several places in the New Testament, Hebrews, 1 Peter chapter 5, other things that talk about the responsibility of leaders. Okay, what about teachers? Well, James has a lot to say about teachers. All of us, we have been given. I don't know. We're not all doing the same thing because we have certain things that in the New Testament have been taught: the appointment, selection of elders and deacons, the responsibility and accountability of males and females in the church. All of that is found in the covenant, New Covenant, right? So, we'll have a reading of my mom's will regarding certain things. My brother and I will sit down and address that. He's been the one chosen by my mom to be the executor, yeah, of the will. And so he has that responsibility, right? But it's a reading of the will. Whatever we do as a church, we have a reading of the what? The will that came into effect when the testator died, my mom, or put it larger than that, when Jesus died. What came into effect? His will. We have the first reading in Acts chapter 2, and then we have all these New Testament books, which by inspiration preserve the will, the covenant.
Well, that might have been part of what Luke was trying to say, because we're all going to be held accountable.
Exactly.
So there you got one group of people you respond to, but then teachers are going to be held more accountable, elders are going to be held more accountable, but we're all going to be held accountable.
We're all accountable.
But
For the service.
But there is degrees of accountability.
Yeah, absolutely.
But Scott, also, I think that through all these things, that it's a warning to people, because he knows human nature. He knows that, like, elders in the church, just like I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos.
Yeah.
They look to get people like them, and they get factional. And he's warning us against stuff like that.
And this is, I think, goes back to what Nick says. The application is, to me, this is a cautionary parable, not only to the leaders of Israel, not only to the apostles, but to all the followers. We're stewards and we're accountable. To me is what the basic message is.
It all kind of goes back to what I was thinking about, which I'm slow this minute. I'm slow going. The believers and the disciples, not disciples, but the ones under the leaders and all, we all are giving gifts.
Yeah.
And I think the parable, instead of monetary, is talking about, it's an example, it's not like a gift God.
Yeah, I think it's
And we don't explain how to use those gifts. And we don't use those